folks, everybody sing. Now when the saints go marching in, there is a house in New Orleans. Pumped a lot of pain down in New Orleans.
We took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans.
Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in.
Welcome back to the History of New Orleans. We last left off with the end of the Reconstruction period, when the American federal government tried to secure the civil rights progress bought with blood in the Civil War through a military occupation in the South. It ultimately failed, with federal troops pulling out in 1877 to leave black people and Republicans in the South to fend for themselves against an embittered and empowered white supremacist society. In New Orleans, the black community was more established than anywhere else in the South, and we will go over how their unique situation made their experience of the coming Jim Crow regime different in some ways than the rest of the country. It might come as a surprise to some just how fast this regime would take hold. The rollback of civil rights in New Orleans took less than one whole election cycle. To get a full picture, let's look back a little to the landmark elections of 1872, where Republican William Kellogg won the governorship in Louisiana in a hotly contested election. At this same time, a slate of Democratic candidates won the municipal elections in New Orleans, and in 1874, the Democrats also won a slim majority in the state legislature. We can see in these 2 years the relative downfall of the Louisiana Republican Party, which would precipitate the coming of Jim Crow. While Kellogg held the governorship and the Republicans had a majority in the state Senate, there was not much the Democrats could do to fight against civil rights. Instead, the conflict between the parties caused the machinery of government to come to a grinding halt. The inability for the governments of Louisiana and New Orleans to cooperate stoked the anger of the electorate. They resolved to break the logjam of party squabbling by electing one party ticket in the 1876 elections that would be in consensus on every issue. By now, the electorate, at least the active voting portion, was majority white, as initiatives to re-enfranchise ex-Confederates and terrorist intimidation against black and white Republican voters skewed the rolls conservative. It didn't help that the state Republican Party was in complete disarray by 1876. The Custom House Ring and the War Moth factions had grown so far apart that it was impossible to tell that they were part of the same party. Civil rights had ceased to be of any concern to the Republicans, as they diverted their entire energy to backstabbing one another and trying to wring as much money out of the state as they could. In a 6-day nominating convention, which was more like 6 days of shouting and fist fighting, the Republicans finally settled on a ticket for the election in 1876, with most of the delegates being unhappy with at least some part of it. The Democrats, on the other hand, were organized and disciplined, largely due to the power of the White League, which had survived the Battle of Liberty Place and the subsequent federal crackdown to become the de facto ruling faction of the Louisiana Democratic Party. Due to the fact that the Republicans had completely abandoned the issue of civil rights, and they were publicly seen as an ineffectual and corrupt institution, there was even a portion of the formerly unified black voting bloc that jumped ship to the radically racist Democratic Party. Almost 30% of black voters in Louisiana casted their vote for Democratic candidate Francis Nichols. However, just like in 1872, the results of the election came down less to what the voters wanted and more around what the counting board decided. Under another heavy cloud of controversy, the board decreed that the state had gone Republican across the board. Louisiana's 8 electoral votes were pivotal in the presidential race, allowing Rutherford B. Hayes to clinch it and repay the black voters there by ending Reconstruction upon entering office. For the governorship, the board declared that Republican candidate Stephen Packard had won over Nichols, and the rest of the Republican ticket triumphed in the legislature and Senate. In yet another repeat to the election of 1872, the Democrats contested the results and ended up setting up their own rival government in New Orleans. This time, however, the National Republicans, who owed their victory in the presidential race to the Compromise of 1877, which removed federal troops from the South, would not back their colleagues in Louisiana. As the White League again marched on Jackson Square in 1877, there were still the Metropolitan and Freeman militias there to meet them, but they lacked the support of the federal government, which had given them a strong base in 1874. As a result, the White League was able to hold the Cabildo under arms and allowed the Democrat-controlled city council to usurp Packard and place Nichols as the governor, recognized by the city of New Orleans. And so, in January of 1877, 4 months before the official end of Reconstruction, the last flimsy barricade against reactionary Democrats collapsed in New Orleans, and the era of segregation and racism commenced with a coup. As recompense for New Orleans' backstep towards the evil days of slavery, there was a biblical plague. In the summer of 1878, the city experienced the worst yellow fever epidemic since 1853, killing nearly 5,000 people. Now, whether you believe the disease was God's wrath against the city or not, the timing was convenient for those looking to fight against the coming tide of reaction. And there was to be some pushback from the progressive population of New Orleans. Here in our city, the wealthier Afro-Creole community still held some power to influence the course of politics, and there were still Republican elements that wished to continue to fight for civil rights. The problem was that none of these people could find enough common ground to come together and pose a real threat to the Democrats. As a result, the Democratic ticket won across the city in 1878, but only with a plurality. If opposition had been unified, then the conservatives would have been defeated. In this way, New Orleans yet again serves as an example of what was happening across the country. Conservatism and reaction was not successful because it was so much more popular than progressivism, but because it was more unified. There were working men's parties, civil rights parties, reform parties, and many more who all found themselves to be in opposition against entrenched political power players, but who could not unify under a single banner, and were thus defeated one by one. It was because of this that we began to see the ascendancy of one organization in particular in New Orleans, the Regular Democratic Organization. This group, also known as the Old Regulars, the New Orleans Ring, or just the Ring, would be the central player in New Orleans politics for the next 70 years until it was finally broken by a reform movement in 1946. The Ring would be the driving force behind Jim Crow, segregation, and just about any other regressive policy that stains the history of New Orleans. Their first victory came in 1876 with the election of Edward Pillsbury, but the election of 1878 was really when they solidified their control over the city, when Isaac Patton became mayor. It was also in 1868 that they gained their infamous nickname, as critics in the press posited that the nomination process for the party favored friends and business partners of the party leadership, these so-called creatures of a ring. The press claimed that it really took the power of selecting candidates out of the hands of the people. Yet these creatures of a ring knew that ultimately their success would have to come at the behest of the citizens of New Orleans, so they continued to wear the veneer of populism. They circulated a questionnaire asking the citizens of the city to give their opinion on several reform laws and assured everyone that they were committed to rooting out corruption and even that they supported equal educational opportunities for black and white children. Of course, none of these reforms would actually be implemented, and the Ring was very much in favor of segregation and deprivation for black children. But as we saw, these empty promises did work somewhat. They did manage to capture enough of the reform voters and black voters to win the election. The Ring swept into power in 1878 with a clear mandate for change. The city was in a poor state of affairs when it came to money, and there were the chronic issues of race relations and public health to contend with. On the point of race relations, the Ring, to perhaps no one's surprise, immediately reneged on their promise to uphold the rights of the African American and Afro-Creole community and sided with their reactionary constituents. In a landmark piece of legislation, they formally split the New Orleans school districts into white and black schools. This legislation was then upheld by a white judge when an Afro-Creole man sued the city to allow his children to attend a white school. This was the beginning of the infamous separate but equal precedent that would soon be the law of the land throughout the country. At least the black community was benefited by the universal improvement of the public health system in New Orleans, as the Ring managed to stamp down on disease and provide better care for its citizens. Even with the major yellow fever epidemic in 1878, the 2 years that Patton served as mayor saw the lowest death rate in the city since before the Civil War. But everywhere where progress was made, there were also concessions to either entrenching white supremacy or further enriching and empowering the Democratic ring. For example, in order to shrink the debt of New Orleans that had ballooned out of control since 1862, Mayor Patton's administration came up with the idea to form a board of private wealthy citizens who would be authorized to liquidate or purchase portions of the debt. The members of this board would be chosen by the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the Speaker of the House, effectively making it an avenue of patronage, which would essentially allow the friends of the Democratic leaders to own up to half of the city's finances. All of these issues and more meant that New Orleans stumbled into the post-Reconstruction era on shaky legs, but the Ring had a plan to solve all of their problems in one decisive action. Their main target was the City Charter of New Orleans, through which they could not only enact dramatic change without the need to go through the tedious process of legislating hundreds of individual bills, and could instead just pass a whole slate of modifications tied to the charter. So, in January of 1880, the State House of Representatives met in New Orleans to hammer out a new charter. Before we go into the details of what the charter did for the city, we should make note that the old charter was not a bad document. Even Democrat supporters had to begrudgingly admit that it was all around efficient and fair. It did, however, carry with it the curse of having been instituted by a Republican administration during Reconstruction, and the Democrats, beyond logic and reason, were determined to burn anything Republican out of the city and the state. To that end, the charter completely remade the structure of the municipal government. No longer would there be a city council of 7 members and the mayor. It stipulated that there would be a direct election of a mayor, a treasurer, a comptroller, and a superintendent of public works. The rest of the document was haphazard and inconsistent, with clauses referring to other parts of the document that had nothing to do with them, and some legal language that either on purpose or accidentally gave the city council the extremely powerful ability to revoke any private business license on a whim. In the end, it was shoved through the legislature in the final hour of their session. The governor, despite being a Democrat and as corrupt as the Ring, refused to sign the charter. It was simply that bad. Having failed to achieve their most desired goal of the term, the Ring was facing down fierce opposition in the 1880 elections. A special election for sheriff of New Orleans in 1879 seemed to affirm the popularity of the Ring, as their candidate earned twice as many votes as the opposition. But an investigation into the election uncovered obvious fraud on behalf of the Ring, which completely soured public opinion on the establishment party. The media in New Orleans stoked the flames of the public's disgust by publishing many editorials criticizing the undemocratic way the Ring Democrats worked through politics. By the time the campaign season arrived, it was obvious that the moment was ripe for a reform ticket to usurp the Ring. Notably, however, none of the non-Democrat parties in the city were able to muster enough strength to pounce on this opportunity. It would have to be within the ranks of the Democratic Party that the opposition would gather enough support to challenge the Ring. When voters finally went to the polls in November, their choices were either Reform Democrats or Ring Democrats. Any other vote would be practically useless. There were 6 other tickets outside of the Democrats that ran in 1880. None of them would come close to contesting the election. The results were surprising and a bit confusing. In these days, the entire ticket for a party was grouped together on the ballot, so most voters just voted the same party down the ballot. However, in the election of 1880, the Reform candidate for mayor, a Mr. Joseph Shakespeare, won by a slim margin of 441 votes. Meanwhile, the Ring won out with huge majorities for the rest of the municipal offices. What could have caused this discrepancy? Had the Reformers fixed the election for Shakespeare and forgotten to do the same for the rest of the ticket? Or was it the Ring that did the fixing and forgot to include their candidate for mayor? No official investigation into the election turned up any conclusive results, so we can only speculate on what happened. In what was becoming a rather embarrassing tradition in New Orleans politics, sitting Mayor Patton refused to accept the results of the election. His contention wasn't that either party had committed fraud in the election, but that the election itself was fraudulent, Since the legislature had promised to produce a new city charter, and since the governor had vetoed the one that they made earlier that year, the municipal elections should not have been held. Eventually, Patton was persuaded to step down by a court order from the state Supreme Court, and Shakespeare took office in December. Now this new administration took office with yet another strong mandate for change. Whoever people were voting for, they expected them to make big changes to the governance of New Orleans, to fix the problems that it faced. Unfortunately, for over a quarter of the city's population, none of the major parties were the slightest bit interested in addressing their concerns. This quarter was of course people of color, and they were as diverse a group economically and culturally as the different ethnic enclaves of the so-called white race, yet they were all being discriminated against equally by the Democratic administrations. Many people of color voted for Joseph Shakespeare in the 1880 election because they hoped that his reforms might bring some relief to them. But even if Shakespeare had wanted to help them, his hands were tied on most matters by the Ring candidates that had won out on the city council. And to be clear, Shakespeare did not want to help the black residents of New Orleans. During his 2 years in office, he commissioned monuments commemorating both Robert E. Lee and the Battle of Liberty Place, aka the White League Insurrection. Both monuments celebrated figures that had fought against the progress of racial equality, and they stood in New Orleans until 2017. These were just the aesthetic slights against the black community. There were plenty of discriminatory policies that actually affected the livelihoods and rights of this integral portion of New Orleans society as well. There may have been consensus between the Ring and Reform wings of the Democratic Party on the issue of race, but that was just about all that they agreed on. The late 1800s in New Orleans was a time of struggle. There were competing challenges in the city that made solving problems exceptionally difficult. On the one hand, the city lacked many of the modern amenities which marked the truly prosperous cities of America. Some 100 miles of its roads lacked pavement, and those that were paved did not have proper drainage systems, so that when it rained, which it often did, the streets were flooded with stinking water and refuse. There was not an adequate water pumping system in the city, so buildings would often burn down while the firefighters fruitlessly dumped pails of water on the raging inferno. Likewise, the gas pumping system was also inadequate, and was a costly burden on the city budget. Perhaps worst of all was the education system, which tried its best to educate the children of New Orleans, with just over half of what its required funding was. The student-to-teacher ratio was around 56-1, and many of these teachers had to beg their students for tuition because the city could not or would not pay their salaries. On the other hand, many of these issues could not be solved, at least by the government, because despite every administration since 1862 trying to balance the budget, New Orleans was trembling under the massive weight of its public debt. And how could it reduce its debt? Raising taxes didn't seem to be helping, since despite the fact that New Orleans made up a quarter of Louisiana's total population, it was paying nearly 3/4 of the state's total taxes. This is why the Ring Democrats of the previous administration had set up the Liquidation Board to try and lower the burden of debt, but this was a temporary and not all that effective reprieve, with some serious consequences down the road. On top of all this, New Orleans was struggling to advance into the modern age in its economy. It was still operating a lot like the provincial trading post it had been founded as in 1718. Most of the city's revenue came from exporting cotton and sugar, while its manufacturing sector was pitiful compared to other American cities of comparable size. As we have already mentioned a couple times, this identity as a trade hub was being threatened by westward expansion and the spreading of railroads across the country. So the Shakespeare administration became another in a long line to take office with a mandate for change. This time they had the energy necessary to do it, but they faced impossible odds. Perhaps most frustrating to the new mayor were his colleagues. The Ring men knew how much trouble the city faced at this important juncture in its history, but they were more interested in looking out for themselves and wringing whatever wealth they could out of New Orleans. Both of Shakespeare's attempts to reform the fire department and police force were met with extreme opposition from the Ring. These two offices were prime real estate for the patronage system, and any tampering was out of the question. The lack of movement on the police force particularly led to the founding of two secret societies of private citizens, the Vigilantes and the Committee of Safety. These groups were indirect descendants of the Committee of Vigilance that, if you recall, formed to protect the voters of New Orleans during the elections of the violent pre-Civil War years. These groups were also good examples of how, when the process of government met internal resistance, it fell to private interests to pick up the slack. While it is commendable that many affluent citizens of New Orleans pitched in their own personal fortunes to help the city, it created an expectation that there would always be such altruistic patrons to help the city, and that the government could rely on these people to help where they could not. This eroded public trust in the government, and when private citizens no longer helped as much as was needed, the public had no one else to turn to. It is perhaps the internal resistance that Shakespeare faced during his term that led him to seek extra legal solutions to his and New Orleans' problems. One such example of this was on the issue of gambling. Gambling had always been a staple vice of New Orleans. Along with booze and prostitution, it was one of the most hated, yet widely popular modes of entertainment in the city. Numerous attempts had been made to regulate or eradicate the gambling dens, but none had proved even slightly effective. By 1880, there were reportedly 83 different gambling establishments in the city, and any time the police raided one, 3 more would pop up. Shakespeare hoped that by legalizing, or at least decriminalizing gambling, he could better control the spread and curb the worst offenses of the business. But the state constitution was pretty explicit that there would be no such leniency towards criminal enterprises like gambling, and so Shakespeare had no recourse under the law. Instead, he created the Shakespeare Plan. Under this plan, there would be an unofficial licensing system that he would control. Since the mayor was also the chief of police, he was able to control the police force and instructed them to avoid harassing or extorting any gambling establishment that paid him an under-the-table fee. This was the kind of slimy, underhanded policy making that had to be made to get anything done around the ring, and surprisingly, it worked like a charm. The number of gambling establishments in the city dropped from 83 to 16, and these 16 were much fairer than any previous den had been, since Shakespeare used part of the fees he collected to hire a private investigative firm that made sure the games were run above board. Gambling remained a staple part of New Orleans' entertainment industry, and perhaps one of the 16 was the infamous House of the Rising Sun that lent its name to a famous American folk song. But in the end, the Shakespeare Plan was so effective at curbing the vice in New Orleans that even though a grand jury investigated the administration and found that the practice was extra legal, they commended the mayor and advised that no punishment should be doled out. The success of the Shakespeare Plan was a huge deal for New Orleans, but it was overshadowed by another massive change that came towards the tail end of the Shakespeare administration. The failure of the legislature to pass a new city charter in 1879 had not dissuaded the people of New Orleans from seeking to remake the framework of their government. In May of 1882, a new convention was convened to put forward a new charter. The document that finally passed the legislature that year, in advance of the November elections, included the dramatic changes that the public had been asking for. Without getting too far into the weeds of the legal language of the document, we will make note of the most important details of the new charter. For one, it greatly changed the governing body of the city. The city council went from 7 members to 30. These 30 would be directly elected by the public, but they had powers to regulate their own membership. The body could, by a 2/3 vote, exclude any person from its membership. This effectively meant that any person representing radical breaks from the status quo, or guardrails against the consolidation of political power within a certain demographic, would probably not get to serve, even if elected. Even though it was not explicitly stated in the wording, this provision excluded people outside the dominant group from taking public office, for example, black people, or those who supported civil rights. The new charter also greatly expanded the power of the mayor. It extended him and the rest of the executive branch's terms from 2 years to 4 years. It gave him veto power over any ordinance passed by the city council, and gave him complete control over the city police force. The rest of the provisions made in the charter go into minute detail on many issues facing the city, which we do not need to go into. We will end the discussion of the charter by noting that the legislature that passed the document also made another monumental change to New Orleans. In 1879, the excitement around a new charter had stirred energies in Baton Rouge, to return the state capital to its premises. Since that charter had not been passed, the capital remained in New Orleans, but renovations to the old state buildings in Baton Rouge continued for the next 3 years. By the time the charter issue came back around in 1882, the renovations were complete, and the legislature officially moved itself out of New Orleans and back into Baton Rouge. New Orleans had been the state capital from 1812 to 1849 and regained the title during the Civil War. Now, in 1882, it would cede the honor to Baton Rouge for the last time. November of 1882 was also the first time that elections would be run under the framework of the new charter, with the important caveat that the mayor would still only serve for 2 years until the 1884 election. It's hard to say why they shortchanged the next mayor, but we can assume it was to slow the rollout of the new charter so as not to rock the boat too much. Once again, the election came down to 2 Democratic tickets, a Reform one and a Ring one. Shakespeare did not stand for re-election, and the Reform Democrats had a hard time finding someone to replace him. The Ring, on the other hand, had their perfect candidate, with William Behan. Behan had been an integral part in forming the White League, and led a company of men in the insurrection of 1874. It is funny how politics in the South and the North were complete opposites at this time. Up north, many Republican candidates were able to defeat their Democratic opponents by quote-unquote waving the bloody shirt. This was a phrase that harkened to an apocryphal tale of our old friend Benjamin Butler, who supposedly waved the bloody shirt of a carpetbagger on the floor of the House of Representatives in an impassioned plea against the Ku Klux Klan, who had supposedly whipped the carpetbagger. Republicans would campaign against Democrats by reminding their constituents that the majority of the party had supported secession, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of Americans dying in the Civil War, thus waving the bloody shirt to play on the anger felt by Northern voters. On the reverse, the South often saw Democrats playing up their involvement with the Confederacy and white supremacist groups in order to paint themselves as defenders of Southern freedom against Yankee despotism. This played well with many white Southern voters, not so much with black voters, but as Jim Crow tightened its grip over the coming years, this demographic quickly faded into obscurity. The Reform candidate for mayor did have the bona fides as an officer in the Confederate Army, but that paled in comparison to Behan's resume as one of the major leaders of the White League. The Republicans did not even put forth a candidate in this election. As a result, Behan won the election with nearly 3 times the number of votes as the Reform ticket. For the first time in a long time, the results were so conclusive that no one could even dream of contesting them. Behan might have been the Ring's perfect candidate for the campaign, as his popularity among the majority white voter base all but ensured a landslide victory, but he was not their man once he took office. The new mayor's main task set forth when he began his term was the smooth implementation of the new charter. The new government was much bulkier and intrusive than the previous one, and by contemporary accounts, Behan did an admirable job at navigating the pitfalls and obstacles. One of the most persistent obstacles he faced was his own party. The Ring had a certain expectation that offices in the new government would be filled by men that served the party well and had seniority. Behan, on the other hand, wanted to fill these offices with qualified men, even those that may be outside of the Ring. For a while, he was able to finesse his way around the Ring members of the city council, but by the 2nd year of his administration, he ran face first into a trap. The all-important position of chief of police was left vacant in 1883. The Ring had a man in mind, but Behan wanted to fill the position with someone who had no political ties in order to keep the police force outside of politics. Both sides dug in their heels, but in the end it came down to Behan's decision alone. It would have been better politically for Behan if he had just retreated on this one and tried again during his 2nd term. As it turned out, though, he rammed through his nomination against the wishes of the party and irrevocably split their partnership. As his term drew to a close, Behan expected to receive a renomination by the Ring. They conceded to this point, even though they were really opposed to him now. They felt that they at least owed him this consideration because his term had only been 2 years. But the renomination did not come without conditions. These would greatly restrict Behan's ability to project his vision over his own government, so he refused them and thus refused the renomination. In his place, the Ring nominated a man by the name of Joseph Guillot. Unlike Behan, Guillot was a party faithful through and through. He gained popularity among the Ring leaders precisely because of his opposition to Behan during the man's term as mayor. Guillot, however, was not popular outside of the party. On the whole, the voting population of New Orleans at this time despised career politicians and the idea of a disciplined and professional cadre of political operatives controlling the governance of the city. The Ring was able to curb this dislike towards them by waving the bloody shirt of republicanism. Anyone who ran against them was painted by their media organs as a threat to white supremacy and a return to Reconstruction policies. This messaging rang hollow in 1884 as the opposition to the Ring nominated Behan after he rejected the political machine. It was impossible for anyone to believe that Behan, a man who had shed blood on the streets of New Orleans in the name of white supremacy, was a Republican. However, the opposition did also have a problem with messaging. Their media organs, particularly the Picayune, railed against the Ring's machine politics, which placed patronage above efficient governance, and had led to what in their assertion was a complete lack of safety, cleanliness, and proper education in New Orleans. Except their mayoral candidate was still a part of that machine. Behan couldn't really run on the platform of government inefficiency because he was the government. Whatever the strengths or weaknesses of each party's campaign was, it didn't really matter because the Ring was already planning on stealing the election. On April 22, 1884, the day the polls opened, up to 1,000 special deputies arrived in each ward and took over the polls. They ousted Behan's commissioners and commenced running the full fraud playbook. They stuffed ballots, threw out ballots, tampered with ballots. Many people who voted for Guillot were dead or had been absent from the city for years. Some people voted twice. It was a completely embarrassing mockery of democracy. In the end, the votes were tallied by a commission of Ring loyalists, and Guillot was declared the winner by a huge margin. Guillot was the first mayor to serve a 4-year term, and the years he was in office can be characterized broadly as a degradation of city government. For all the whining and complaining the white supremacists did over supposed Republican mismanagement in the years after the Civil War, once they managed to oust all the progressive elements of the city government, they proved themselves to be even worse at attending to the needs of the citizenry. No longer could the Democrats blame black people for the shortcomings of the government because their political power had been sidelined. Some hardline reactionaries made the argument that all the regression during the Guillot administration was due to the Ring appointing their own cronies to positions in the government, and not because of white supremacist attitudes. But they failed to recognize that the whole reason the Ring had any power at all was because they claimed to be a bulwark against Republican radicalism and promised to uphold white supremacy in New Orleans. Even though on the whole the city was languishing under Ring rule, there were bright spots during the Guillot years. For one, modern amenities were beginning to appear in the city. Royal Street became the first street in New Orleans to be illuminated by electric light, and that same year St. Charles Avenue became the first road paved with asphalt. Earlier in 1880, a massive riverway improvement project had seen huge deposits of mud at the mouth of the Mississippi River removed, which allowed larger ships to pass through and on to the ports of New Orleans. By 1884, the city had really begun to benefit from this increase in shipping, and revenue from trade once again began steadily climbing. 1884 also happened to be the 100-year anniversary of the first cotton bale sold to foreign markets by Americans. Seeing how in the South cotton was king, it only seemed natural that there should be a grand celebration in honor of their monarch. And since New Orleans had the honor of being the market where the most cotton was sold in the last 100 years, it made sense that it would be the host for the World Cotton Centennial. For a city struggling under the weight of massive debt, the centennial celebration was an unnecessary expense that promised no return on investment. The down payment alone for the host city was $500,000, or $16 million in today's money. However, it was important to New Orleans in the way that it changed the narrative for the city and allowed optimism to return to the general population. There was a sense among the citizenry of New Orleans that the city was on the decline. Even though it had continued to grow both in population and private wealth, The prevailing attitude was that political gridlock was slowing or even reversing New Orleans' destined march to greatness. The Centennial changed that attitude, as it gave the people something to be proud of and reminded them that they were still one of the most important cities in the South. Outside the domestic boost to morale the Centennial brought, it was also a good public relations boost to the rest of the country. For over a quarter of a century, all the news of New Orleans that had reached the rest of America was about terrible political violence, plagues that killed thousands, and corruption scandals. It was starting to affect the desire for people to move to the city, especially wealthy businessmen and educated professionals that the city desperately needed. The Centennial was the opportunity for New Orleans to be shown in a favorable light to the rest of the nation for the first time in a long time. The cost of the exposition quickly ballooned, as a Mr. Burke was appointed as fund manager for the project. He managed to procure a loan from the federal government for $1 million and got another $500,000 in donations from private organizations and individuals. Burke was also appointed to lead the preparation of the buildings that would house the exhibition. These would be several massive structures built around 4 miles away from Canal Street, specifically just for hosting the exposition. Among these buildings, the most notable were the main building, 33 acres in area, the government building, the horticultural hall, the art building, and the Mexican building. They would house exhibits from every state and territory in America, as well as many foreign countries who were big customers of Southern cotton. There would also be exhibits that highlighted every aspect of the cotton business, including a department that specialized in showing the experience of black people in the cotton industry. This department was headed by Blanche Bruce, the first African-American man to serve a full term in the U.S. Senate. It is doubtful that he was able to show the true evil of slavery, of which he was a victim, but it does show that there was pressure on the Centennial from the more civil rights-oriented North to include at least a mention of the black experience. There was also mention given to the experience of women in the cotton industry, thanks to a department headed by Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the lyrics for the Battle Hymn of the Republic and was an energetic supporter of women's suffrage. All put together, the Cotton Centennial was shaping up to be an even bigger celebration than the 1876 American Centennial in Philadelphia. And the Cotton Centennial was truly a world exhibition. Apart from the United States, there were 29 countries who hosted exhibits of varying sizes. Of these, the Mexican exhibit was by far the largest, not even including their own building. The amount of ground covered by the Centennial was way too much to only be used for cotton. There were also exhibits dedicated to the farming and processing of the South's other staple crops, such as sugarcane and rice. These were joined by exhibits of exotic plants, exhibits dedicated to various administrative departments in the American government, a mineral exhibit from Mexico, the aforementioned women's exhibit curated by Julia Ward Howe, and a wide variety of exhibits from all the European countries. We should make a special note about the African American exhibit. The report used as a source for this episode includes quite a lot of detail on the planning and content of the Cotton Centennial, but is unfortunately tainted by the author's views on race. This is often the issue when citing contemporary sources, that their biases and character flaws can often distort our view of history as it really happened. The author fails to provide ample and descriptive detail for the African American exhibit, as he does for the others, but does not miss the chance to make a colorist remark. He complains that the exhibit does not truly represent the accomplishments of black people because it was curated by people of mixed race. Blanche Bruce, like many people of color at this time, was the son of a white slave owner and an enslaved woman. Colorism is the term used to describe how within racial or ethnic groups, people of varying skin tone are often treated differently. Lighter-skinned black people are often given more privilege than their dark-skinned kin, and in the 1800s in particular, the accomplishments of successful black people are often attributed to some amount of quote-unquote white blood in their veins. It is just another unfortunate example of the travesty of racism that even this celebration of the black community in the Cotton Centennial could be perverted in the historical record. As much as white supremacist historians loathed to give any credit to people of color, they couldn't help but be enticed in an Orientalist sense by the exoticism of the Asian exhibits. Japan, which at the time was undergoing a massive cultural and economic revolution as they attempted to forge a new identity, using traditional Japanese culture and European capitalism, was eager to show their art to a Western audience at the centennial. Much like the European displays, the Japanese strayed from the subject of cotton to include pieces of porcelain and silk, as well as an elaborate tea market that was a huge hit for the people of New Orleans. In contrast to this, the other major Asian delegation, that being the Chinese, leaned totally into cotton. Everything they exhibited was either made of cotton or used in the making of cotton products. So varied and beautiful were the Chinese cotton products that it made the European delegations a little embarrassed that they were showing products that had nothing to do with cotton in an attempt to upstage the Cotton Centennial. The whole exhibition ran for a little less than 6 months, from December 1884 to June 1885. The organizers wanted to avoid having huge crowds of tourists during the hot months of summer, when yellow fever epidemics were most deadly. In the end, the Centennial was a flop in the commercial sense. Of the $1 million the federal government invested in the project, it only ever recovered a little over $175,000. Likewise, the private investors in New Orleans never really saw any returns on their investments. However, the Centennial was a massive success in terms of revitalizing the energy of the city. It was lauded in the press both in New Orleans and across the globe as a wonderful exhibition of art, industry, and human cooperation. The World Cotton Centennial is often cited as the founding event for the New Orleans tourism industry. Although the cost prohibited another World's Fair type event from coming to New Orleans for the foreseeable future, more and more people would visit every year for Carnival, Mardi Gras, and other unique New Orleans cultural touchstones. Above all, the Centennial was a good distraction from the troubles that plagued the city, at least for the 6 months that it ran. Already as the exhibition was wrapping up in May of 1885, there were stirrings in the political scene of New Orleans around the opposition to the ring. The problem the reform platform ran into during the last municipal elections was not that they didn't have a popular enough base, but that they were late to the game and far less organized than the ring. So this time, committees and groups began organizing in 1885, 3 years out from the next election. They hoped by having prolonged opposition to the ring in New Orleans, they could create the idea that there was systemic dislike for all machine politicians and sway the public opinion greatly in their favor. The two most prominent of these organizations were the Committee of 100 and the Law and Order League. Both were led by wealthy, influential men from New Orleans, but the Law and Order League also included men and women from the middle and lower classes. Both attempted to fight the ring machine from outside the government using the courts, but since judges were appointed by the government and relied on the government for their salaries, these suits went nowhere. Out of the failure of the Committee of 100 and the Law and Order League came one more important organization. This one, formed in 1888, was known as the Young Men's Democratic Association. It was inspired by the nomination of former Governor Francis Nichols by the Democratic Party in the state elections. Back in those days, winning the Democratic nomination for governor was equivalent to winning the election itself, as they regularly took home more than 75% of the vote. Nichols was the first man since 1843 to be governor of Louisiana twice, and he was definitely outside of the ring. This gave hope to the reformers in New Orleans that, with Nichols' help, they could finally achieve the reforms necessary to wrestle control of the city out from under the grip of the ring for good. Given the importance of this mission, the YMDA resolved to wait and see what would happen during the primaries of March 22nd before they made any action against the ring. The municipal primaries, much like the statewide ones, were essentially the elections themselves, as there was hardly any competition to speak of. Because of this, the ring found it necessary to intimidate and assault anyone they caught voting against their interests. There were a few scenes at the polls reminiscent of those violent days before the Civil War, where voters were shot or beaten by thugs. These incidents would turn out to be dreadful foreshadowing of the actual election in April. 2 days after the primaries, the Democratic Party met to formalize their nominations. The party was split between factions that aligned either with gubernatorial candidate Nichols or the incumbent governor Samuel McHenry, the brother of John McHenry, who was the opposition governor supported by the White League in 1874. The delegates for the convention were largely of the pro-Ring, pro-McHenry faction, and so the nominations ended up being a foregone conclusion. For mayor, they nominated a Mr. Davy, who was one of the ring's leaders, a ringleader if you will. The rest of the nominations were along these same lines, with the friends and partners of the ring getting the most prized positions on the ticket. 4 days after the nominations were sealed, the YMDA met at Washington Artillery Hall to discuss their next move. They settled on nominating their own ticket, one that would be led by well-respected former Mayor Shakespeare. This reform ticket managed to get the endorsement of General Beauregard, who was still a very influential name in New Orleans. Other prominent men fixed their support to the reform ticket, including men from across the political spectrum. Former Governor Henry Warmoth, who was the Republican candidate running against Nichols in the gubernatorial race, forced his party to endorse the reform ticket in New Orleans in lieu of making their own nominations. It was kind of humorous that a candidate endorsed his opponent's supporters in the most important city in the state. Warmoth would end getting blown out by over 80,000 votes in November. Across the aisle, incumbent Mayor Guillot, previously elected under the ring ticket, broke from his faction and threw his support behind the reformers. The momentum was behind the YMDA's heading into Election Day on April 18th, but there were still worries that the election would be stolen by the ring, using thuggery to intimidate the voters. So the YMDA organized their own thugs, with the stated purpose that they were only there to make sure that the election was carried out fairly. But that meant that an already very contested and heated election would see the presence of 2 opposing paramilitaries at the polls. It could have been a disaster, but as it turned out, the thugs hired by the ring were absolute cowards. Wherever they showed up and saw the YMDA out in arms, they turned away without attempting to engage in violence. So the election passed under a tense atmosphere, but it was largely peaceful. Without the help of the thugs, the ring was thoroughly defeated on every ballot except 2. Shakespeare's second term was just as successful in fighting corruption and improving the city's finances as his first. Despite opposition from a dedicated cartel of ringmen that remained in the city council, Shakespeare was able to enact several sweeping reforms that cut down the possibility for graft. Most impactful of these was his creation of a professional fire department. Up until this point, the fire department had been run by volunteer societies. These volunteers were effective in their jobs as firefighters, but the problem lay with how the money provided to each society was doled out by the government. Big contracts were awarded to friends of ring bosses, and slowly over time the upper management of the volunteer societies became entangled with the political machine, which hampered their efficiency and called into question their motives. Shakespeare swept aside the volunteers and established a board of fire commissioners who would now run the city with a direct budget from the mayor's office. New Orleans also made great improvements to public works during Shakespeare's administration. St. Charles Avenue had already been paved with asphalt in 1884, but that material was still not as widely used as it is today. Instead, many previously dirt roads in New Orleans were improved with gravel and chert by 1892. The streetcars that are so iconic for the city had up to this point been pulled by either horses or steam engines. Between 1888 and 1892, the city began experimenting with electric streetcars that would soon become the standard. In fact, electricity was spreading throughout the city, as after Royal Street became the first electrically lighted street in 1884, many others followed suit. Although it should be noted that this was done over the veto of Shakespeare, who preferred gas lighting. In the field of education, New Orleans also improved with the creation of the Howard Library, a private institution that would eventually become the city's first free public library. There was also the founding of the Louisiana Historical Association in 1889, which was first established to preserve Confederate history, but has since become a great resource for learning about all aspects of Louisiana's varied history. In 1888, a wealthy white Creole woman named Josephine Newcomb opened a preparatory school for young white women in New Orleans. This preparatory school was founded to help prepare women to enter Josephine's previously established women's college. The H. Sophie Newcomb Memorial College, named after Josephine's late daughter, was founded in 1886 as a coordinate college to the male-exclusive Tulane University. This was the first instance of the model of a coordinated women's college connected to a prestigious university, that would later be copied by Bernard and Columbia, as well as Pembroke and Brown. Many of the improvements made to the general welfare of New Orleans were done outside the prerogatives or even against the wishes of Mayor Shakespeare, but his general attitude of reform inspired the people of New Orleans to dream outside the confines of government bureaucracy, and thus reinvigorated the city heading into the last decade of the 19th century. And indeed, it was events outside of the Shakespeare government that are most remembered about the 1890s. In particular, two events help illustrate how much New Orleans had changed since the end of Reconstruction, and what battle lines were being drawn on the political landscape, despite a de facto one-party state ruling in Louisiana. The first of these events we will discuss will be the killing of Police Chief Hennessy, simply for the fact that it becomes first chronologically. David Hennessy is perhaps as truly a heroic figure as we have ever seen in our accounting of New Orleans thus far. His father, David Hennessy Sr., was a prominent member of the Irish Catholic community in New Orleans before the Civil War. The younger David was only 4 years old when the city was captured by the Union, and it was at this time that his father left to serve in the Union Army. Unlike most white men and a lot of Irish Catholics, David Sr. did not support the Confederacy. Even after the war, David Sr. was one of the few men of New Orleans that volunteered to join the Metropolitan Police to protect the voting rights of newly enfranchised freedmen. It was maybe because of the fact that David Sr. supported the Republican regime that he was killed by a fellow police officer in 1871 while drinking at a saloon. He was to be the first of several Hennessy men assassinated. Young David, at the behest of his mother, soon entered the police force himself as a messenger and apprentice to the chief of police. As the breadwinner for the Hennessy household now, David threw himself into police work with energy and ambition. Before long, he was made detective, then official aide to the chief, and finally named the head of the organized crime unit. Now we should take note that at this time, organized crime was not called organized crime. It was called Italian crime, because most of the organized crime done in major American cities was done by ethnic Italians. This does not mean that most Italians were criminals. On the contrary, the community was just as honest and hardworking as any other in New Orleans, but they were painted with a broad brush as mafiosos to the man. In the 1890s in New Orleans, there was an underground war occurring between the Irish, who were overrepresented in the police force, and the Italian mafia. As head of the organized crime unit, Hennessy was the general on the front lines for this war. His first name-making move came in 1881, when Hennessy was still aide to the chief. He managed to track down and identify a notorious Italian mafioso who was living in New Orleans at the time under the cover of a fabricated identity of an oyster salesman. Of course, the Italian community claimed that the oyster salesman Randazzo, whose real name was Esposito, was a victim of profiling, but the fact that Esposito's compatriots tried to bribe Hennessy with the enormous sum of $50,000 led there to be very little doubt as to the true identity of the man. Hennessy, unlike most men of his station and time, was not swayed by the bribe and managed to have Esposito extradited back to Italy, where he was punished for his past crimes. The arrest of Esposito made Hennessy's career, and from then on he was particularly interested in fighting so-called Italian crime in New Orleans. However, this was not the reason for his eventual election to the position of chief of police in 1889. Hennessy ran on a platform of ridding the city of gamblers, as the Shakespeare plan had broken down during his absence from office, and now the gambling dens were again running rampant through the streets of the Crescent City. Despite his campaign promises, once elected, Hennessy continued to devote most of his energy to prosecuting Italian criminals. He was not, however, prejudiced. There were many well-meaning Italian families in New Orleans that Hennessy worked with throughout his career, and he always made sure to differentiate between the mafia and law-abiding Italian Americans. In May of 1890, Hennessy was at the center of a feud between two Italian families that had led to two separate public shootings. As far as the public knew, the two warring families were just local fruit handling firms, but Hennessy declared to the press that when he took the stand during their trial, he would link them to organized crime and expose the entire criminal underground of New Orleans for all to see. This was the point where the young police chief's fate was sealed. It wouldn't be another 6 months before the Reaper came for Hennessy. On October 15th, the police board was gathered that night for its weekly meeting. Hennessy was in attendance, and the meeting waylaid him until 11 at night. Afterwards, he made his way down Girard Street towards his home with his friend Captain O'Connor. When the two men reached the corner of Girard and Rampart, O'Connor split off and Hennessy continued home alone. A few blocks later, at the corner of Girard and Basin, a young boy whistled a signal, and a barrage of shotgun blasts rang out in the night. Hennessy was perforated by at least 6 shots, and one wound in particular proved to be fatal. As the assailants fled into the darkness, O'Connor came running from down the street and asked Hennessy who had shot him. The police chief managed to whisper an anti-Italian slur before he passed out from the loss of blood. Hennessy was then hurried off to the nearest hospital, and he was able to regain consciousness, but the next day internal bleeding caused him to again pass out and eventually die. The public outcry was deafening, and the police immediately made arrests. Some of these arrests were based on eyewitness accounts that identified at least 3 Italian Americans associated with the hit, but in total, 19 Italians were arrested, and it is doubtful that all of these men were involved. Suffice it to say, the interest in the case made the trial the most followed event in New Orleans news at the time. It was sensationalized by the press, and emotions ran high for all parties in the city. It was nearly impossible for any jury to reach an impartial decision when the trial finally commenced in March of 1891, as there were threats from the non-Italian ethnic enclaves if they did not convict the men charged with murdering Hennessy. And there were threats allegedly levied against the jury by the mafia that if they did not acquit the men, then they would be the next to be murdered. After 2 weeks of closely followed courtroom drama, the results were inconclusive. Since the jury was unable to come to an agreement even for the 4 men who were proven beyond a reasonable doubt to be actual perpetrators of the murder, 4 defendants were deferred to retrial and 6 others were outright acquitted. There was outrage among the citizenry. They believed that it had been a miscarriage of justice and that the courts would be unable to come to a satisfactory conclusion due to the influence from criminal elements. For those reasons, a mob began forming for the purpose of dispensing justice themselves. As is often the case with mob justice, it was imprecise and horrifically violent. Following the inconclusive verdict, a group of prominent citizens met under arms and resolved to storm the parish prison. They arrived at 10 p.m. and proceeded to demand the prison captain let them in. He refused and instead ordered his guards to release the Italian prisoners so that they could hide. Unfortunately for them, the wooden prison doors were not much of a barrier to the frenzied mob outside, and they battered them down and immediately found 2 of the accused men. These 2 were dragged into the street and hung. This did not satisfy the bloodlust of the mob, and they proceeded to murder 7 prisoners who had escaped into the women's wing of the prison, and then later shot 3 more they found at the top level of the prison. Of those that died, 5 of them hadn't even been part of the trial. Shortly after the final 3 were murdered, the crowd dispersed, and the surviving Italians were returned to their cells. The aftermath of this terrible lynching brings to mind another event that we have covered in New Orleans' history. Remember that in 1851, an ex-Spanish general named Narciso Lopez tried to lead a revolution in Cuba with financial support from wealthy residents in New Orleans. When he failed and was subsequently captured and executed, there were riots in New Orleans that targeted Spanish-owned businesses. This event resulted in the precedent being set that the American government was not liable for any violent actions against foreign citizens or their property done by mobs. Well, this precedent came up again here 40 years later, when the Italian government demanded an indemnity from the American government for the extrajudicial execution of 12 of their citizens residing in New Orleans. On top of the precedent, a grand jury in New Orleans acquitted all of the men involved in the murder of the Italians, since the mafia had been found to be involved in the assassination of Hennessy, and therefore the lynchings were justified. This was a pretty crazy verdict, given that it tacitly supported the killing of any Italian immigrant on the grounds that they could possibly be associated with the mafia. Nevertheless, the Italian government accepted this excuse, and just like in the case of 1851, the American government eventually did pay an indemnity to the Italians, with the caveat that it was not an admission of guilt. With that, the matter was resolved. We chose to discuss this event not just because it was one of the most dramatic moments during this era in New Orleans, but because it is also a very clear example of the new ethnic divisions that were defining the city. No longer was it just Anglo-Protestant Americans clashing with Catholic Creoles. Now there were other ethnic enclaves that were big enough and wealthy enough to make an impression on the politics of the city, principally the Irish and Italians. There were also still wealthy Creole people of color and poorer freedmen, but their size and wealth was quickly being offset by Jim Crow apartheid. Their contribution to the culture of the city was still one of the most important in New Orleans, but their political power was slipping away. Alongside the ethnic divides in New Orleans, there was also a relatively new phenomenon present in local, American, and global politics, that is, class. The urban proletariat were beginning to assert themselves on the world stage, and in 1892, New Orleans followed a great global wave of labor action. However, in order to give justice to the general strike of 1892, we will have to end here and pick it back up in the next episode. So please join me next time for the history of New Orleans.